So, good afternoon and welcome to our continuing series of the Reactive Church. Today our topic is about historicalism. Technically, the title is How Looking at the Past Changed the Way We Worship. Our discussion today is a reactive dynamic within the church, reacting to what's happening in society in general. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment, there was a change in the way people thought about their life, their culture, their nation, their place in history. Prior to that time, I'm not sure that we can actually talk about history. There are people who claimed to have been historians and are sometimes called historians, like Eusebius of Caesarea is a very good example. First century Greek scholar, he collected stories, some of which proved to be historical, some of which proved to be mythological, some of which are so heavily amplified that you have a difficult time separating the mythology from the history. But technically, if we say something is historical now, and I hope that Christy, you will correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I was taught at the bachelor's level studying history that to be historical, it had to have some kind of a paper trail or evidence. It had to have something you could footnote or a primary reference. It would be the best thing of all. If you had letters, if you had manuscripts, if you had inscriptions, these sorts of things gave validity to the fact that you wanted to say was historical. Without the background or without the letter, the inscription, the manuscript, what you could do is you could collect information, but you might call it stories, you might call it legends, you might call it mythology. It doesn't mean that those things aren't true. It's just they can't be called historical unless you can back it up with evidence. Well, through the Middle Ages, there were things that are collections of stories. Many are what we think of as the hagiographies of the saints. Hagios is the Greek word for saint. It technically probably just means very holy, but Hagia Sophia, for example, Holy Wisdom, the big basilica cathedral in Istanbul. You know, hagiography means the writings about the holy ones. And so every saint, and you know how many thousands there are, they each had their story, and these stories were written down and they were collected, but were they history? Many of them were much closer to legendary or mythological. But something is happening about the 15th century, 16th century, and it's happening in a world where the past has largely been ignored. Think about the paintings we have from the early Renaissance, where there's maybe a nativity scene. And there is, of course, the historical Mary and Joseph, and there's the baby Jesus sitting in a pile of hay. And they might well be portrayed as being set in a ruin of a Greek temple. And through the background, you can see the Alps. And you know, maybe there's a river down, and then there's a village at the bottom with what looks to like a Gothic church tower. You know, there was not an attempt to portray historical things within an actual context of history. The story was more important than the history. They had also examples we can think of as many last judgment scenes, where you will have everything set in a contemporary costuming, but you will also have dragons flying around and devils with pitchforks and things being portrayed with the same level of reality in the painting as are the historical costumes of whatever the day is. It's hard to say these are historical paintings. In fact, so much history seems to have forgotten that there were many medieval towns built on top of old ancient ruins. The old things seem to have no value to them. Even in the Grand Tour days of the 17th century, British noble people would come back to England having bought all these etchings from Italian merchants showing the Roman Forum that they visited. But you can only see the top third of Constantine's triumphal arch. The rest of it still buried in layers of sediment that have been collected over the centuries. The buildings were not excavated. They were not in any sort of repair The stones often had been stolen, such as at the Colosseum, so they could build more modern buildings. There was not a reverence for the ancient things. It was just a resource, and oftentimes it was considered to be in the way. You might remember back to the beginning of the series when we talked about Constantine the Great moving the capital to what's now Istanbul, Constantinople. And one of the reasons he gave is because he said Rome itself is just such a mess of a city. Everything's falling down. The infrastructure doesn't work. The water systems don't work. It was almost as if he was saying, let's abandon that old place and move to a new place. And I think that this attitude reflects all the way up through until the beginning of the Renaissance, when the old things were just in the way. The only example I know where something is highly valued from the ancient days is, strangely enough, in the cathedral in Aachen, where we know Charlemagne had the throne of his empire, or pardon me, Suzanne, Karl der Große. In English, we always say his name in French, which I don't understand. He could be Charles the Great, but we haven't had any really great King Charleses to compete with other than him. So we'll just say Charlemagne. And if you go there, you go to the pulpit in the ancient cathedral. And remember, this was built, Charlemagne was crowned in the year 800. So this is high Middle Ages. And the decoration on the pulpit is made out of plates, saucers, and bowls, drinking cups of glass left over from the Roman days. They were valuable as gemstones because, frankly, they no longer had the technology for making glass. Glass was a lost art, and the few little bits of glass that have survived destruction from the Roman days were more costly than gold. In that sense, we know that they respected and valued highly these ancient things, but generally speaking, they were living in the moment, fearing the Mongols, fearing the Huns, fearing the Vandals. They were fearing the epidemics, fearing starvation. They didn't have time really to look back with nostalgia or even with curiosity. They were thinking of the present, and their faith was always reminding them that the future will be better. They were very heaven-oriented people because death was always at the doorstep. Around 1480 or somewhere in there, there's not an exact date given, but there's a very common story. I'm not sure if it's his story, but there's a story of the farmer in Italy who's plowing his field, and the plow hits something, and he sees this rock, he pulls it out, and suddenly the whole ground collapses as he falls down 10 feet into a giant cave. And he looks around, how's he going to get out? Finally, somebody does bring him out, but he says, what was that cave? And they lower him down again with a candle, and he sees all the walls are plastered and covered with paintings. He's lowered into what the Italians call the grotto, and he comes back out with a piece of plaster with the paint on it, which everybody says, oh, I've never seen anything like that. And he says, it is grotesque, grotto-esque, meaning out of the caves. But the style was so unusual and strange. They said, oh, that's grotesque. And now we think it means, oh, that's ugly and awful. But of course, it actually means it's something ancient we don't understand. It's from the grotto, the cave. And the caves were discovered all over Italy as these ancient towns were being accidentally unearthed. In the city of Rome itself, on the hill opposite the Colosseum, they fell through and discovered the Domus Aurea, which had been the unfinished, magnificent palace of Nero, who was so hated that when he finally died, they filled in the unfinished rooms and covered it over and planted grass and hoped everyone could forget that Nero had ever existed. So much for historical heritage. But the Domus Aurea is great. I went there on my last visit to Rome. You have to get tickets months in advance, but you go in and you just see splendor, and you can imagine what it must have been like, especially since its name Domus Aurea means house of gold. These discoveries in the early Renaissance time actually became the reason for Renaissance, rebirth, renaissance, rebirth of classical awareness. They started digging out, discovering things. It became the great fashion to have a Greek and Roman statuary in your home, to have pillars on the front of your buildings, to have a triangular pediment over the doors, which we now attribute to the Italian architect Palladius, but it was actually him resurrecting the Greek and Roman architectural styles. It became fashion, but it also changed the way people thought, as they realized that maybe they could learn from the past while they're looking forward to the future. And so began a great several centuries of discovery, as people finally said, let's open up those old ancient scrolls we have down in the basement of our monastery and see if there is anything interesting in them. And as we learned last week, the printing press's invention allowed freedom for academics to actually read books rather than just having to rewrite them constantly. They became less and less scribes and more scholars. Books were opened, read, studied, commented on. New books were printed. They went further and further. And of course, again, we said last week, the Reformation really encouraged this. In the Reformation, the understanding of the past was critical to the theology that both sides in the Reformation were doing. The Catholics went back to the high medieval days, back to the time of Thomas Aquinas, thinking that was enough history. We'll go back and this will be the theology upon which we establish all of our dogma. The Lutherans, the Presbyterians, and the Anglicans, they decided to look back a little further. And they went past the high Roman Catholic glory days of papal empire, and they went back to the humble early church of the 2nd and 3rd century and started saying, you know, we've strayed a long way from this. And so reformers started making changes based on what they had rediscovered by looking back. The Congregationalists took it the furthest. They went back all the way to the biblical example where there was nobody called a priest, there was nobody called a bishop, there were just house leaders, worshipers, apostles, preachers, you know, but they wanted to make it to where the church was very much house church based. Whereas the Presbyterians, they said, well, there aren't ministers called presbyters in the Bible, but there are presbyters who are the elders of the community who carry the wisdom. And let's do that. Let's have a church guided by educated pastors. And so the Presbyterians are on a local level, but they have always a sort of a university educated person, which is why Presbyterians now still wear academic gowns as their Sunday vestment. You know, they don't wear the albs like the Romans in the early church would have done. They wanted to show they were well educated. The Lutherans wore the academic gowns. They rejected a lot of the Catholic things, but they didn't quite go as extreme as the Presbyterians had done. They kept the notion of sacrament, and they kept a lot of the Platonic theology that we also spoke about earlier. The Anglicans always were trying to do things as a country rather than just as individuals. And the royalty in England tried to impose this idea that one church for one nation, and that the church needed to be a unifying force. And so the emphasis was not about theology. They compromised and said, we can have wide variations in theology, but we must all come to church together, pray together, and see ourselves as one church. And so the ancient looking back affected us as Anglicans, particularly in the way the prayer book was ordered. We all have learned in our confirmation classes that it was Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who gets the credit for the prayer book, but he wrote almost nothing in it. He actually just had it translated and organized it. It was based on the Benedictine orders, rules of worship. All the monks going back to St. Benedict had developed elaborate schemes for worship. And those texts were what became, when translated into English, the Book of Common Prayer. It was natural that Thomas Cranmer would do that because in the years before he became a Protestant with Henry VIII, he had been an abbot in a Benedictine monastery. So this was the way he knew to pray. He didn't have to throw it out. He just translated it. And he added one important point to it. It should no longer just be for monks and for nuns. It should be for everybody. So it was common prayer for the whole community to do. Instead of 7 daily services, he whittled it down to 3. There would be morning prayer, evening prayer, and the occasional Eucharist. These were the 3 major liturgies that people were expected to participate in. In a village, the parish priest would hold communion from time to time, but it was the expectation that every person in the village should come to the village church every morning when the bells ring to do morning prayer. Then they go off to their work, they come in from their fields, they go back to the church, do evening prayer, and then go home. This was the ideal, which probably never actually took hold anywhere, but it was the idea, and it was based on looking back to the Benedictine roots, not only of Thomas Cranmer, but also the Benedictine roots of the very first Archbishop of Canterbury, Augustine of, what we call Augustine of Canterbury. Though he wasn't from there, he was Italian, and he was sent by Gregory the Great to come and bring the gospel to Britain, not knowing that the remnant church in Britain still existed, which we now call the Celtic Church. But we had been influenced by Benedictine thinking from the very beginning in Britain, as opposed to many other parts of the European continent that had other pious influences. Looking back, our Book of Common Prayer focused us into praying together, not necessarily agreeing about theology. And so that gave us what we now think of as the via media, that we could have high church and low church, we could have Anglo-Catholic and Anglo-Protestant, we could have Calvinists, we could have Lutheran, we could have humanists, we could have all sorts of influences helping us understand the prayers we say together. And that's still one of the great glories of Anglicanism now, is that we use the past to help us understand that the church has never agreed on anything. We've always had differences of opinion, but the challenge and the gift of the Holy Spirit is that we would be united despite the differences of opinion. Our personal opinion doesn't really matter. It's God's reality that matters. Now, I'm getting into a little bit more of a sermon than I am a lecture, so let me switch back and move forward out of the Renaissance, out of the time of rediscovery, and move into the 17th and 18th century. 17th century, the Renaissance and the renewal of classical knowledge had become so prevalent that it's what we now call the Age of Enlightenment. And you find the typical of the 18th century, the churches stopped being built in the Gothic style and were now being built in what we think of as the Georgian style, because the kings of the 18th century were George I, George II, and George III. They spanned almost the whole century between the 3 of them. And Georgian architecture is very reminiscent to the Italian Palladian architecture, which was by Palladius developed out of Greek and Roman architecture. So it's neoclassical, we call it. Pillars in the front, a triangle over the top, maybe a dome like the Pantheon in Rome, built of stone, steps in the front, simple square boxes, no longer the Gothic frills and the cruciform shape with the long nave and the side transepts. In the 19th century, this looking back is affected by one of the things we also talked about in a previous class, and that's the Industrial Revolution. As the people were moving around, we did acknowledge that they had to reorganize the church to build new things, new parishes, new buildings. And this was informed very much by the looking back. Think in the 1830s, William Pitt and Robert Peel were competing for political control, and when Robert Peel, who was non-aristocratic, was elected prime minister, one of his first And biggest influences in England was what's called the Reform Act of 1833, where he made it so you no longer had to be an Anglican church member in order to matriculate at Oxford or Cambridge. It opened up education to all people, not just established church members. It also built new dioceses, and it tore down some old dioceses. It reorganized, moving cathedrals from one city to another. You know, as the population shifted, they thought this was a reasonable thing to do. But a lot of the old-timey Anglican thinkers said, the church is not a civil service. The church is not an instrument of the government. The church is the living body of Christ, a sacred and holy organism. I mean, no government can disestablish a bishopric. Bishoprics were designed by God. Bishops consecrated by God. They're not of the government. You know, and by standing up for the independence of the church against political power, they carved a place for themselves as the opposition. And in opposing the government, some of them lost their jobs, some of them were silenced by their bishop, some were put out of the church. And I'm talking about particularly a group of people from Oxford University who came later to be called the Tractarians. As the professor of Hebrew at Oxford University, his name is Edward Bouverie Pusey. And Dr. Pusey was, like I said, his historian of ancient languages. And so it was up to him to have a lot of influence in digging around in the archives and translating things out of ancient languages so that they could be understood now. And this one is maybe the most important one of all. Not very famous anymore, but in his day, he was a best-selling author, widely quoted, courted by all the social activities of London, but refusing to participate. He took a parish out in the countryside. His name is John Keeble. And he was considered a genius in his day. At the age of 19, he was given the professorship of poetry at Oxford. At 19, that was a fast rise to fame and glory. And he wrote his book called The Christian Year. It's old Regency style poetry, just before Wordsworth modernized poetry. And John Keeble wrote a poem, mostly sonnets, based on every Sunday of the church year and the themes of the Bible readings. So it combined religion, classical structure, old-fashioned sort of stodgy vocabulary, had a lot of Greek and Roman allusions mixed in, mythological allusions mixed in with the poetry. But people loved it. It was the best-selling book in England in the 19th century, other than the Bible. It replaced John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress as the most popular religious book. And now he's forgotten because his poetry is practically unreadable now, unless you really love, you know, Thackeray and Alexander Pope and all those in between. These three, along with a bunch of others whose names are still remembered in history, though not on the common level, they formed a group called the Tractarians. They did what academics always do when they're in the opposition. They said, we must write an essay explaining why the government is wrong. And they ended up writing 90 essays, publishing them each individually. They were called a tract. And they were grouped together when they were all published into books, the Tracts for the Times, 90 essays. And they became very widely read and very controversial. We'll talk about them more next week as they founded what we now think of as the High Church Anglo-Catholic movement, restoring so much of what came out of the past, the researching the way the early church worshiped, researching the way the early church baptized, researching the way the early church prayed, and it influenced them to leave some of the Protestant radicalism behind and to restore some of the meaningful things that the early church had. So looking back has had the effect of changing our architecture, changing our sense of art, changing music, changing theology, changing liturgy. But it doesn't stop us at the most basic level of still being a people who are future-oriented. We know that our goal is still to move forward, progressively making the world better, making ourselves wiser, making church holier, making ourselves fit to receive the inheritance of heaven, which is our promise and future in Christ Jesus. So I hope you all can come back again next week and hear a little bit more if you're interested. It'll be almost all 19th century Gothic revival, vesture, liturgy, and all those little trivial facts that visitors of the church always embarrass you when they ask, why do you do that? And now, soon you'll be able to tell them.